Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. Mike's a good friend of mine, and the feedback he had from the first podcast was he liked it, he liked all the topics, he liked the myriad of topics, but we didn't go in depth into any of them. He said he liked the fact that it set a good tone for it, but he wanted to do more of a deep dive into these subjects. He wanted to hear more, and he wanted to get more out of these podcasts. Today, we're doing exactly that, going on a deep dive into some really personal topics, some important topics about life and how he's lived so far. And he's a man I admire, and I like the way he thinks. It's very clear cut, straightforward, and logical and rational. We hope you get value from this conversation. Mike, thanks for being here, man. Appreciate it. And we came to talk because with the first episode that you had seen me do with Trina, you wanted a deeper conversation. And I had said, right, the first episode, though, was kind of to give an idea of all of the things that we talk about and go into. And you really wanted to go into going deeper, like actually doing a deep dive, exploring a subject. So we're going to do a deep dive on doing a deep dive today. What made you think that? Like, what is it important to you? What experiences did you have that made you realize the importance of going deep? Like what experiences have you had with doing that?
I think there's a bunch of experiences I've had, both in the business space, but then also in the personal space. So speaking specifically to that, when you first spoke to Trina, for me, listening to that, there were so many things. Like the one thing I specifically remember, I think it was about like 18 to 20 minutes in. I can remember exactly where it was when you were talking about like the point of this, or I can't remember if it was the conversation or the point of the podcast, saying how to grow, growing and pushing yourselves outside of your comfort zone. And then I remember I kind of like leaned in, like, well, I want to hear more about that. But then the conversation kind of went on, and for me, I think there was so much more within that that could have been a whole conversation to itself, but the conversation kept continuing.
Right.
And there were a few things like that, points in that conversation. So for me, like that was like specifically what I was referring to with that. But then to bring it back to the question you asked me about, like what it is in my life, I think for me the epiphany around it was more within the business context.
Okay.
First, but then I see how it then translates to life. So for me, business life, okay, I'll just answer the question. So within the business business context, 10, 15 years ago, I had a blog related to urban gardening. My background's in online digital marketing. This is the first time I did my own thing, my own project. I was in charge of doing everything. What I found myself doing was just doing a lot of different things, content-wise.
Okay.
How to do this, why do that, how to grow carrots, why I'm growing food, here's how to build this container, all of these random things. So then when I'm having a conversation with somebody, it was, I have this blog about urban gardening, which is vague, which is uninteresting. What that means to you is going to be very different than what that means to me.
Right.
So then I just started thinking about, okay, how can I better control the narrative and better control what it is? So if I just take one thing and just go deeper into that, not saying I have to live there forever, but just go deeper into that, which for me was the importance of growing food.
Okay. So as in like your whole purpose for what you're doing in the first place, not just what I do, but this is why I'm doing it.
Right. So then when I was talking to people, I have an urban gardening blog where I focus on the importance of growing food.
Okay.
And which helped to steer away from the annoying questions of I have these bugs on my plants, what do I do? And I'm just like look it up.
Right. Right.
So for me that was like the first point, but then that translated to everyday relationships with people, what I'm focusing on in the moment.
Right.
What, how many different hobbies do I have? What am I doing on a day-to-day basis? Am I doing all of these things of which you're really doing nothing? It's like, for me, that mindset started translating into those other areas of life.
Are are you familiar with the law of minimums?
No.
So I heard this from Cliff 13 years ago, and I don't know where it came from. I've not looked up the originator of it, but it comes from nature of observing growing in agriculture. And say a plant needs five things. It needs phosphate, iron, copper, nitrate, and water. Let's say it needs a minimum of all five of those things in order to grow and to bear fruit or to replicate seeds, to do what it's naturally supposed to do. If it doesn't get enough phosphate or nitrate, but has an overabundance of the other four things, it's still not going to produce if it doesn't have the minimum requisite level of at least one of those five things. And I think that's where a lot of people neglect when it goes to going deeper, is they have a superficial brushing with either a hobby or their business or their relationships, where they actually don't go into like, oh, okay, what are the things where I need a minimum of these things to actually, for it to bear fruit, for it to do what it's supposed to do. And that for me has been one of those things, because with relationships, it's that trope in films where it's like the husband is like, you have a great home, you have a great car, the kids are clothed, they have friends, we're not starving, we have an overabundance, we go on vacation. What else am I supposed to do? Well, your son misses you reading him a bedtime story. It's like, yeah, but I'm doing all the rest of these things more than most men. Like, I'm successful and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but if you took a little bit away from like one of those things and just gave, that extra half hour that you got to a bedtime story, then it would actually bear the fruit that you want. It's just the minimum. And it's kind of a trope. Sometimes it's used unfairly, but at the same time, I think people do that. It's a way to like beat their head against the wall of, yeah, I know I need at least these five things to have a happy relationship, or for my wife to feel like I'm being a good husband or father, but I'm doing an overabundance of these four things. It's just this one little thing. Yeah, but if you're not at that little requisite, if it's not meeting like just minimum, where it's like the whole thing, I do all of these great things, and just once a month I go to the strip club and I'm a bad husband. It's like, well, if like that's the one thing that makes your wife think you're a bad husband, well then if you could get rid of that one thing, then it sounds like it would all be gravy. But it's like that may be a little bit of an extreme, but it's that type of deal where I think people actually avoid going deep and looking at what would actually solve the problem, where it's like being busy rather than being productive. They're not, because they're literally not producing when it comes to the fruit. You can give it all of the phosphate and water and sunshine it needs, but if it doesn't get enough nitrates, you won't be productive.
Right. So to take that example of what you just gave with the husband-wife relationship, so then for me, what that means going deep, and I haven't always been this way, I think, working towards progress, work in progress, is having those conversations with my wife, but having it at times not where we're in the thick of it and head to head and butting.
Right, where you bring it up before you have to.
And then also, so this was probably a few months ago now. It's probably the last time I did it, which means I probably need to do it again. There was something that happened between us. Nothing crazy, nothing bad. But I fell into that place of putting the blame onto her for it, which never works out well. So it's like, okay, how can I go? So for me, it's like the thought is like, okay, how can I go deeper within myself? And because I'm the only thing I have control over,
Right.
or or
To at least some extent.
yeah. But then, kind of like what you were just saying, with that example of husband and wife, is if she says this is the one thing, then that's the one thing. So then we were eating, and I just said to her, I'm like, I want to be a better husband. What can I do? And just so put it, so asking her to give me that feedback, because I'm telling her what I would like to do. I'm like, I can do all of these things. I could, you saying I could get the job, I could get the picket fence, I could do all of that. But if that's not what she wants, and my goal is to be a better husband to her or for her, just going deeper within myself. First of all, to get the balls to be able to ask that and admit that I might not be doing, which is
Right.
difficult.
Right.
But then also I think for me, it's also the challenge in pushing her to go deeper as well, to be able to have that conversation, because that's not an easy conversation. It's not easy for me to ask, for me,
Right.
to ask that. But then it's also like hard for her to be like, well, you're not like.
Well, what I actually need is
Right.
like, all of these things, but like this thing, there's an actual ratio going back to like the requisites. There's a ratio of positive to negative interactions with your spouse that are necessary for there to be a good relationship. If it's like 9-1 positive experiences, the relationship won't last. But it's all positive. But also the same thing goes for negative to good, where it's always awful, it's stressful, it's terrible, it grinds you down. So the ratio seems to be like 6-4 in favor of positive experiences, which may sound close to 50-50, but it's actually you have 50% more positive experiences than just the negative experiences when it's looked at that way. And where it's actually people are different no matter how well they're matched, and if they're not, there's a difference between a fight to have a fight because you're bored and a fight to have the fight to find a solution. And I've had relationships dissolve because I only fought if I was looking for a solution. If I had a girlfriend who wanted to fight because she was bored, I was uninterested and I wouldn't engage, which for her meant I was uninterested in her and I didn't care to fight for the relationship. Like, no, like, this fight is pointless. If you want to have a fight to find a solution, I will have that fight with you. Absolutely, let's go. But when I found out that there's actually a ratio that you have to stay within, roughly at least, it made a lot of sense of where it's like, oh, there like actually has to be some because if that contention is not going on, it means someone is not speaking up. And sometimes it's one of the spouses not speaking up and it's one of the spouses not asking. And we typically know when there's something wrong with the spouse going on with spouse. And then when we don't ask, there are all these times where it's like, well, you didn't ask, so I didn't share. Well, I didn't ask because you always tell me nothing's wrong. So, and I've done that. I've been in that trap before where I could tell something was wrong, but I could tell she wasn't ready to talk about it. And then when she was all pissed because I hadn't asked yet. It's like, well, you clearly weren't ready to talk about it. Well, I still would have liked to have been asked. Well, okay, maybe I can work on that. And I did. I was like, okay, when you're ready to talk about this, I can see something's wrong. Let's talk about this. But when you're ready, when you're prepared to. But I really liked the fact that you could recognize asking the question before it needs to be asked. There are times I buy flowers at Costco when I go to my folks. I get them for my mom, sometimes for a friend. Sometimes it's just I do it just do it because I think about it, or there's a sale. And I get a bouquet of flowers, and almost every time the cashier asks me, like, oh, what's the occasion? Or most often, it's, what did you do wrong? And I said, nothing. I said, I've done over 60,000 miles on a bike, motorcycle across the USA. There's a lot to be said for preventative maintenance. It's a lot easier to stay out of a hole than to get out of a hole once you're in it. And they always laugh, and it's tongue in cheek, but it's true, is where it's like, if you can see some of the warning signs of pitfall ahead, make detour, take caution, that's like, okay, let's see what we can do here, instead of what it seems like a lot of folks do is, it's not fair. Why is there a pitfall in the first place? I didn't put that there. It's someone's fault. Maybe you're right. Does that help you? No. Okay, what's a successful strategy? And that being able to ask a question and go deep of like, okay, why is this going on?
Mm-hmm.
I agree that is important. What I did want to ask you was, because you grew up big city kid. I grew up small town kid, cloth diapers. But when you and I talk about our ideal future, we talk about a lot of the same things. And what I would like to know is, was there something specific that made you start going deep as to like, oh, I want to live out in the country. I want to be out of the big city. Like what is it that made you then start to think about, okay, I don't like where I am. Let's go, let's scoot, let's move. Like what was the thought that made you go deep, and what did you find when you went deep as to why you then made such a drastic move?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, as I started working on myself, as I started getting older, my late 20s, early 30s, and I started doing more growth work, it was always trying to find like that big picture vision of where I want to go, and kind of like looking at that vision, and then like, what are the steps, micro and macro steps need to get there. And in doing that exercise, it never felt like a line. It was always the airy fairy nice things to say. I want freedom, I want financial security, I want $1 million, I want this house, and all these things. And I was like, that's always just kind of what came to mind, just because that's what we're told, and it sounds good. And do I want it? Yeah. But then when I started putting the pieces in place to start going towards that goal, once I hit that first pothole or hit that first obstacle, I was just like, I don't want to do that, because I wasn't really driven by that vision.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would probably say for me it was about 5 years ago I started to get a little bit clearer of what that vision was. And then I would say once the pandemic hit, it became crystal clear to me. It was, so at the time we were in New York, we were living in Staten Island, so one of the most lockdown restricted places. And this was, I think the lockdown started, I want to say end of March, beginning sometime in April. I can't remember exactly.
Right.
So this was a solid 4 to 6 weeks before that. Our son wasn't even a year old yet. It was just a normal Saturday, what I thought was a normal Saturday. Went to the grocery store to pick up a few things, come back less than 2 minutes later with a weird look on my face. And Jasmine's like, what happened? Why didn't you get anything? I'm like, I couldn't get into the store because I didn't have a mask. Mind you, this is like 4 to 6 weeks before the lockdowns and all of that. And then I said to him, like, this is about to get very serious. But my immediate thought was, it doesn't matter how much money we have in the bank, because we had money in the bank. It doesn't matter how much money we have in the bank. None of that matters. If I can't supply the basic needs for myself and for my family, what good am I? And then if I do need to do things that I feel are against my faith, my will, my values, what message does that send to my son?
Right.
So then for me, that's almost like how I kind of look back and like of that moment of, I don't care about the job, I don't care about the money. I need to be able to be surrounded by, or I want to be able to create a life where no matter what happens in the outside world, we are okay. So whether that's the power goes out in a winter storm, we are fine. The zombie apocalypse is coming, we are fine.
Right.
None of that happens, we are still fine. And in the world of which we were living in up until that point, and still, to a degree now, very reliant on outside. I'm not saying community and people, government, corporations to supply
stores, businesses, the infrastructure.
Yeah, to supply their basic needs.
Right.
Again, basic needs being food, water, shelter.
Right.
Anything above that, it's a luxury. It's nice.
Right.
So for me, like, that is the moment, or that's the story. That's probably like 3.5 years ago, of which like brought me to that realization. And just started going like deeper. For me, just going deeper into that, like all the relationships, family relationships, friend relationships for 20, 30 years, like how. Like, where did all this stand? For me, it was built on sand. It was all like we were very much on our own, and being shunned to a point. And it's like, this isn't like by friends, by family, and it's like this isn't what I want. I don't think this is what we want as a family. But this is good because this forces us. So then the next step in the story was a few weeks later, a few months later, with Oscar's first birthday. This is in the middle of the lockdowns and quarantine and all of that. None of my friends and family showed up to his first birthday. So I remember one of my friends showed up, and Jasmine's sister and her father showed up. But I remember saying to Jasmine that morning, I'm like, this is the greatest gift anyone could have given us. Because this now forces us to go deeper. Like, who do we want to be?
Right.
They could do that. Do we want to? Do we want to? I don't know, it sounds condescending, but do we want to sink down to their level and meet them where they are, or do we now need to rise up above that and be even more of the light, or be more true to who we are, and be better people than we are, despite how we perceive we're being treated? And then what example does that send to our son, and then to others as well? So despite all of that, it's very easy just to go down to, it would be very easy to go down and be like
base survival, groupthink,
the tit for tat, butting heads kind of thing. But like for me, like I remember saying to him, like, this is going to force at least me to go deeper. Like, who do I really want to be, and then how do I then rise up and do that? And not saying I'm right, not saying I'm wrong. But it's just like, for me, that was just like, going deeper into it, going deeper into myself.
Right.
Which brings to Idaho, this country, Idaho.
Well, the Great Pacific Northwest. So the word decision comes from the Greek dekare, and it means to cut from. So an incision is to cut into. An excision is to cut out, to excise. And a decision is to cut from. And so when we make a decision, it's not always about it being right or wrong. It's just when you have a few or a plethora of options, once a decision is made, even if it's not necessarily the best decision, at least now you have one thing to focus on, and you don't have, option paralysis. And that's one of the things that took me a while to work out. Was my mother is a radical individualist. And to a certain extent, that's how I view myself. And it took me a while to learn that me just saying, oh, as for me and at my house, this is what we're doing. There are other people who take that as a judgment, or me saying I'm right, you're wrong. And I'm going, no. Like, if that's what you and your house decide to do, cool. Until it maybe starts to affect mine, then perhaps we have to have a discussion. But that was one of the big things about the 2020 PSYOP, was the realization of how many people, once they're a little bit afraid and their frequency drops down and it's all about fight or flight. Whereas for me, 2020 was the best year I had. It was one of the best years for personal growth, emotional well-being. Just like the year before, it was the best year I'd had for business, and each year since it's been great. And a lot of that though has to do with where we live. And I was discussing it this few days ago with Cliff about America. Despite where we are now, it was still populated by people with the initial idea of, I can go to America and just with the sweat of my brow be self-sufficient, own land, and make a living and even a profit. It was peopled by a population. The population was built by people who had the idea of, I can go be there and be there self-sufficient and own land. Like, even in Europe today, talking about oil and gas ventures, or to mine, there are people who are like, what do you mean you can go out and drill for oil in your ranch? Like, oil belongs to the crown. Like, that's what they say in Britain. It belongs to the crown, or it belongs to the state. Wait, like, you can go and like just develop your own mineral rights on your property? Wow, that's wild. So imagine what it was like a few hundred years ago of, we can own land. I can grow crops and sell it. And there's still something of that in the American DNA, and especially out west and in all the rural areas, I think, though, but particularly in places where you don't have garbage service. You grew up on a dirt road. You have a half a mile driveway that you have to clear yourself. It's an entirely different mindset, and people like that think differently, where it's like, you were like, oh, today I couldn't get groceries unless I did what the city council says I have to do. Where I'm from, if there's a shutdown in the supply chain, it's like, we have a herd of deer in the backyard and we have firewood. Whereas in like some parts of Europe, you're not even allowed to harvest firewood off of your own property without a license. It's insane, but it's what they're used to. And I love that about America, and where we live is in that DNA. There's still that idea of, with the sweat of my brow, I can make it. I can make a life. And for people who don't think like that, it's not only inconceivable, if it is conceivable, it's terrifying. And it never crosses their mind to go deep and ask, wait, why is that scary? Why is that such a bad thing? So it's interesting to me, to come from Manhattan, New York, uptown, downtown, and be so drawn to the idea of backwoods living, off grid, self sufficient type of stuff. Was it because you just became so aware of how not self sufficient you could be in that situation in the asphalt jungle? Or like, what was a draw? Was it a call back to nature, call back to wild, like just a sense of like being a dad and being able to like go and harvest a deer and I can feed my kids? It's not filet mignon, but it's meat and it's protein and they'll be strong. Mm-hmm. Non-GMO. Mm-hmm. Free range.
I think it's part of what you just said, just in terms of just not just being somewhat self-sufficient, but I'm also not naive and think it's going to be lone wolf, because the lone wolf is the one, what do they say, lone wolf is the one that get. So but I think part of the experience was just seeing like I understand community is important, and community is necessary for people to thrive. It's where people are communal. They've always been, except for cities and all that, communal. And then just seeing what happened and how the relationships that I had, again, both family and personal, were very thin, and there wasn't much to them. Finding people that can then either be part of or build community around, so that we can then be there physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, be there for each other. And then the reason or how we landed in Idaho is the way when we were looking up homesteading on the internet, which is always a bastion of truth, Idaho and Tennessee were always like number one, number two on any of the lists. Just kind of looking at them, cursory, did not get into. In looking at it very quickly, Idaho was just more free when it came to everything. When it came to life, Idaho just had more freedoms. Tennessee, surprisingly, had a lot more restrictions. More free than New York, but still had certain restrictions.
It's not saying much.
Yeah.
Right.
So then even before that, being the naive New Yorker, I thought everyone's moving to Florida, everyone's moving to Texas. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go somewhere else. So then in looking, came across Idaho. So somehow we came across Idaho, and then I just thought South Dakota, like southwestern South Dakota. So then literally the research that I did was I looked up the one article and saying how Idaho is one of the best places to homestead. Here's all the reasons why. Then it mentioned a little bit about this was just Idaho in general, not even like northern Idaho. Then it mentioned a little bit about northern Idaho, and of course it mentioned Richard Butler and Aryan Nation and all of that, even though it's 25 plus years later.
Right.
Still mentioned that. And then it mentioned Orofino for whatever reason as the best place. So like literally that was just an article that I skimmed. And then I saw a couple on YouTube that are up in Sandpoint that were doing homesteading just because I wanted to see what it actually looked like. Side note, ironically enough, they do like homestead porn. I don't know if I ever told you this. They do like homestead porn, which is apparently a whole separate genre of things.
Oh yeah, it's like food porn and cabin porn.
No, they use that's all separate conversation. But I didn't realize at the time, but I watched like a video or two of theirs, and then.
But like, just to be clear, it's not actual pornography.
They use it as a feeder for.
Really?
Yeah, it's all separate.
Oh wow! Holy!
Okay.
Like because I just was thinking like the colloquial terms of like food porn, of where it's
No.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
well, that actually does sound like something that would go on in the backwoods. Yeah. Okay.
So then saw one or two of their videos. Didn't know that part at the time, and then to kind of fast forward to the end, it was just one day. It's like, yeah, let's just drive out there. So the three of us, Jasmine, Oscar, myself, and our dog. Went in a car.
Your bear dog.
Yeah. Our big wilderness Pomeranian. Drove 4 days to North Idaho, across the country. Not knowing anyone, not knowing anything. Stayed here like a week and a half, 2 weeks. We loved it. New York was still in the middle of lockdowns and all of that. We got here and we could see people's faces and smiling, and we felt like we were in a completely different world.
Right.
We went to the grocery store for the first time. I almost cried. I'm not exaggerating. And then we're like, okay, we have to move here. We have to figure it out. We got to get here. And then this was in the middle of like all the crazy housing stuff too. And it was very difficult. Just hearing stories from people is very difficult for people to get here and move here and find places. So that was April. And then we packed up the car and moved here in July, 3 months later. And it was, again, just another 4-day drive. It was a 4-day drive back, but then another 4-day drive here. And just remember the conversation for me over and over again was, it's like, this is going to be a huge stretch and challenge for us. Like we knew nobody here. We know nobody here. We're all, we're older just meaning
not 20s.
Right. Not even not in 20s. We're just not in college anymore. Where it's like that built-in community.
Right.
Community kind of stuff is there. So we're older. I always say, as I've gotten older, I don't want more friends because I don't want to be dating and doing all of that. But the reality of our vision, getting what I was saying before, like the vision of where we want to go, for me was I felt most head and heart aligned. So I felt very pulled by it, as opposed to being pushed by. I always felt pushed by what I didn't want, but never being pulled towards anything. So being pushed, it's like I could, pushing, I can keep, but if I don't know where I'm going, I could get pushed anywhere. But now I feel like I'm being pulled towards something.
Nice.
So that those obstacles of talking to people and getting out of my comfort zone there was meaning behind it. But I'm also the kind of person like I could strike up I don't have problems just eye contact, saying hi to somebody or stranger, and just making having conversation. It's definitely, for the both of us, it's a strength that I have. Jasmine not so much. So it was just, as we were out in the playgrounds and grocery stores, at the gym, I'm just trying to find ways to meet people and connect and have conversations, as difficult as it may be, because it's like I don't want to start making friends again, but for where we are and why we're here, I need to, or we need to.
It's so weird that you bring that up, because with the breakfast that we do each Thursday, and it's always kind of different people. I didn't realize what I was doing was networking. I was just doing it because I enjoyed spending time with my friends, and I enjoy hosting.
And it's communal because we're in.
Yeah,
it's community.
And it takes me back a little bit to what my mom has said a few times, and I've heard her say it to friends of hers too. Was as all 5 of us were homeschooled, and all of us at one point wanted to go to high school, and I went to school when I was 10 in Germany for a little bit. I did a few days in my hometown, and it was just all very boring. And what my mom would say is, and I've heard her say to other people was, oh, my kids, they all at some point wanted to give it a try because they think that with a lot of people there, that means they can make a lot of friends. Then they realized that's not true. And it's like, right. And that's one of the fun things about these groups we're in and the things that we do, is where it's been able to find people where it's like finding our tribe. And I have some clients like that too, where being able to have deeper conversations with them. I've had some loan me books. I've had them offer to put me up for the winter when I'm not working. This was years ago and stuff like that. And it's really nice knowing that there are a bunch of people where if I'm in a bind, to some extent, I could lean on them.
Mm-hmm.
And they know that they can lean on me if they need to. And I've had a few friends do that. If they need a hand to move, if they need something done, if they need a strong back, if they need an extra hand. That's one thing I enjoy about still being relatively close to my folks, is I can just go give them a hand with stuff. A thing that they can't do, or that would take them 5 hours, that takes me 1 hour, and then they're laid up for a day because their hips hurt and they're in great shape and all, but still feeling able to contribute has been one of the big things for me. And going deep on my end and discovering that about myself has led me to some of the changes I've been making, such as hosting the breakfast the last year and other decisions I'm making right now, and finding out the reasons for what I'm doing instead of just going on autopilot.
Mm-hmm.
And also, one thing I found is I liked what you said about you're feeling now pulled instead of pushed, and that was something that Cliff helped me realize was the difference between inspiration and motivation is the difference between force and power. So force is motivation, and that can and will fail. And some folks will say, oh, that's why there is discipline, because it's discipline that keeps you going when motivation fails. For me, though, it's a huge feedback. Am I forcing myself to do this, or am I inspired to do it?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm inspired, I get pulled out of bed. I'm up late, up early, and I'm inspired. I'm being pulled along. And we know the difference. We can feel it. And there are some things that I don't want to do, but I know I have to do, so I just do them. And I try to adjust my attitude around that and go, okay, I said I would do this. I'm going to do it. It's good that I do it. Let's just get it done. And then with my upbringing, I then feel good about it because I feel pride in doing something difficult just because it needed doing. And then again, so I then changed the attitude about it. So I, in a way, I had to force myself to do it, but I then could still feel good about it, even if I maybe complained a little bit along the way. With the concept of going deep, I had a deep conversation with a close friend of mine yesterday where I got called on some things and we were able to discuss it, and it allowed me to go deep because I trust this friend and there's a lot of love and mutual respect there. And I didn't like where it took me. But that's also how I know that that is exactly where I needed to go, was because I didn't want to go there. When you talk about going deep, what is kind of your process in exploring the depths? Do you have a friend? Is there a book you read? Do you have some sort of ritual to find out, oh, okay, I have these passed before me. What do I need to do to find out what's actually important for me to do? Do you have any sort of ritual or experiences doing that, consciously?
So I think as an example of a kind of conversation we're having this week around friendships here, with Jasmine and I, because we're doing, we've in the little over 2 years now that we've been here, we've been able to establish friendships individually, each of us with people, as a couple as well, and just knowing like the direction that that we're moving in. So the conversation I was having with her, because we were talking about doing something that would, for lack of a better word, expand our friendship. Bring in new friends or bring in new people. Something. It was like something related to church. And then we talk about it, and we just kind of like laugh, just falling into it and figuring, and okay, I'm going to do this, and kind of figuring it out. And then after like a day or so, I just kind of was thinking about it, and I said to her, I'm like, do we need to be collecting more friends? Like, knowing, like, are we on vision? Mm-hmm. Or are we proceeding with our vision? Are we on mission? Are we on point? Because I'm not saying it has to be like super, like,
not completely detailed and all
right.
laid out each step of the way.
Right. But we have a pretty solid network of friends for only being, for being here a little over 2 years. And we kind of know where we want to go. And we know these groups, these groups of people are probably, we think, are headed down the same path. These groups of people, they might be, but we really haven't had that, had a conversation yet. These groups were still it's still shallow, circumstantial kind of relationships. And then these people are definitely not, at all, but we just hang out with them. And so, so I said to her, I'm like, so before extending our network, let's just go deeper with, thinking of it as as those groups of people, like go deeper into those relationships to see if there's something that we're all aligned, to see what then comes of it. Because if we just wanted to keep the friends and all of those relationships, we didn't have to move here. We just could have stayed back in New York and kept all of our old friends.
Right.
And I think that's the hard part, because it was comfortable.
Right.
I think that's the hard part.
It's the known and the familiar.
But then for her, and again, I think this is where it becomes a little bit of a challenge. But for her, it's like immediately she hears, we're not going to hang out with these people anymore. I'm like, I'm not saying we're not going to hang out with this couple or these people anymore. But do we, like, if we, most of the relationships we had in New York, friend-wise, if we saw them every 2-3 times a year, 4 times a year maybe, not often, just because of life, distance, where people live, and all of that. Those people could kind of fit into that category. But these other rings of, again, this is the way my mind thinks. It's kind of, it sounds kind of cold when you're talking about friendships and all that. But this group of people, like we should we should attempt to hang out with them more often.
Right.
If they don't want to hang out with us, that's fine, because then it tells us something. So then let's.
You can just reorient from there.
Yeah, and it and it like even as I'm saying it now, it sounds like a very cold, calculated way to think about relationships and all that. But it's like
you
I don't
have to though.
Yeah, but it's like just to be. The word that keeps coming up to me over and over again, it's the first time I'm saying it now, is just intentional. Just being super intentional with everything.
Right.
The conversations, the words that are coming out of my mouth, who I'm surrounding myself. So even being intentional with the friendships of like, you're the sum of the people you spend the most amount of time with, or whatever that's saying.
Right. It's you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Right.
Right.
So it's like just thinking of our friends in those groups, and for the most part, when I was forming those groups, she was in agreement. But then she's like, "But we're not going to hang out with them." I'm like, I'm not saying we're not going to hang out with them. We're just not going to. We're going to hang out with them just as much as we do now, which isn't that often.
Right.
But these other people, let's hang out with them more.
Right.
Let's go deeper into those relationships.
Right, because there are going to be some. Why spend the same amount of time with people where the relationship is more situational, circumstantial, and superficial? Why spend the same amount of time with them as this people where you have a deep, abiding connection?
Right, and
that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and to the point where you said before, like the person or the people that have your back.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, well, so and so, these people will have our backs. We know that. I'm like, but we've never discussed it. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have thought the friends and family in New York would have had my back.
Right.
It was never discussed. So
Yep.
So we didn't know. Even if
Yep.
we have that discussion, things could still change in the moment. But at least there's a discussion and an agreement on the table. And it's not saying we're going to invite people over and hang out with them and being like, okay, so the next time lockdown happens, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get like not saying that. With some people, those conversations are going to be easier because it's already the relationship and the dialogue around that stuff has already happened.
Right, because you could at least ask them, what was it like for you?
Yeah.
Because, like, one of the reasons I know why we became friends was because, well, I can't put my thumb on a specific time, but I know from our conversations, me just saying 2020 was one of the best years of my life. It was productive, it was happy, it was great, helped out my folks. It didn't change my life one whit. In any way, shape, or form, it didn't. In no way did it change my life at all. And just from, and then hearing you say, couldn't get food because I didn't have a mask or wouldn't put one on. Screw that. We're going somewhere else. It's like, okay, like we have some shared values of don't bully me. And if you try to, I'm either going to fight back or just not be there. And sometimes, did you see the Karate Kid?
Of course.
Okay, I didn't, so how dare you say that. But there's a scene there, and because I heard about this when I was 14, because being 14 years old, I was into seminars. And there was one where it talked about a scene in the movie, the first one I think, where the kid is up on a pier out in the water or a piling, and he's going through all of the motions, and Mr. Miyagi chucks something at him, and he can't dodge or block it, so he falls off and lands in the water. And he comes up, and he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? What should I have done? He's like, well, there are some things you cannot fight or block. Right, so what do I do? He said, well, in that case, the best thing you can do is practice the law of absence. Don't be there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the unfortunate things with a lot of people I've known ever since, Trump derangement syndrome to pandemic panic syndrome is where the first inkling I had of it was I was going to the beach in Florida and getting my tan on in my Speedo and posting it to Instagram. And I had my European friends, some of them were responding to my stories going, this is thoughtless this is so rude because some of us are actually like scared and we're locked down and we can't do this. And you're on a motorcycle trip on the beach. That's not cool, man. And I was like, oh my God. Oh, this is wild. And I then realized I'll probably always be friends with this specific person I have in mind. But it's never going to go past a certain level because we have different values. If I had been if I had been abroad like the plan had been instead of in the deep south that winter, because I'd just been there the year before in Germany and I got stuck there. Do you think seeing my friends back here who are just like me enjoying themselves and going out skiing and then biking and doing all this stuff, it would have never occurred to me, guys, how dare you post that? How dare you share with me? Cuz I'm over here locked down and just the government won't let me do squat. How dare you? I would be, man, I'm so glad the entire world isn't nuts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you guys are doing that. Thank you for giving me some hope. It's an entirely different mindset. And with a person like that, you can't go deep. You can't go into, yeah, but here's why. Here's my thought process. They can't hear it. They won't hear it. They will refuse. And it will irritate them. It will literally irritate their spirit, and then you're the bad guy. It's not the government. It's not their official who shut them down, who's locked them down, who says you can't go outside except to walk your dog. I'm then the bad guy. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is getting way too close to like Spanish Inquisition, wearing a yellow 6-point unit star. Like, this is nuts. And I was like, oh, it was nice though, because 2015, 16, and 2020, as much as it polarized people, it really got rid of the fence sitters. And there are a lot of people I know personally who were kind of like very laissez-faire and, just like live and let live. What's a big deal? Why get involved with the community? Just with the community. Who cares who's the mayor? Who cares who's the city council? Who cares who's on the school board? To where it's like, oh, this is important. Or, you know what? I can't just sit on the fence because there's actual oppression and evil going on. And like there are a lot of friends who landed on my side of the fence, as it were, because they're like, oh, this is just nutso. I can't be on the fence about this. And it also came down to, so I call it the Ugg boot alarm. So I hate Ugg boots. I've always hated them on girls. Disgusting, absolutely gross me out. It used to upset me to see girls wearing Ugg boots out in public. And then I began to realize, I was like, oh, I'm so glad they're wearing Ugg boots with their white tank tops and their black leggings in the middle of July because they're sweating and uncomfortable. That girl has no sense of style, does not think for herself, and I'm so glad that I know I don't have to talk to her because she's cute. But all the rest of that stuff, those Ugg boots let me know everything I need to know that I would never want her as my girlfriend. And I know that may sound dumb and extreme, but that's what a lot of this writ large became, was no more people were sitting on the fence, where it may be entirely destructive and just ruinous for our country and political system, but at least now I can actually talk to people who are like, oh, it's whatever, like people will do what they do. Now it's driven some of my friends away, but it's also made it possible to have like deeper, more serious conversations and have deeper, better relationships with friends because they care more now about who lives next to them. They care more about the relationship they have with the person who lives next door. And I think that's good. So.
Yeah, and taking that and then just thinking like what my thought process has been after, during the 3 years, and how it's forced me to kind of really go deeper and really think about what I know. So our old pediatrician back in New York, he would say there's three ways that people typically know things. You have the experience, therefore you know. You have that sense of connectedness or that gut feeling, so you know that way. Typically it's stronger in women than it is in men. The third way you know is because someone told you. And what he would hypothesize or theorize or say is, we live in a world now where most people know because they're told, or they read it. Whether it's they're told in school and they're told. Not only they're told, they just accept it as truth because they're told by somebody else. Whether that's school, whether that's your boss, whether that's the internet, Google, whether that's their Facebook. So that's how you know. So for me, moving here to Idaho, coming from, especially North Idaho, that's good, super specific, North Idaho, coming from New York or whatever other cities. Like I said, I read that one thing and talked about, Richard Butler and the Aryan Nation and all of that. I'm like, is that true? This one place says it. And I remember saying specifically to Jasmine, I'm like, because she's like, oh, I'm going to do more research. I'm like, it's just a bunch of random people on the internet that are giving their opinions. We're not going to know until we go there and until we experience it. So Let's just go, because then we will know. But then that's really forced me again to go deeper of like everything. Like how much do I know? Like how much of the stuff that I'm saying do I know it because I experienced it? I have firsthand experience. Or just it's, how much of it is that gut intuition. So even in having conversations with people, again, you're just going deeper into the conversations. And I don't know if you've picked up on it, but when people say things, I'm always like, please define
your words and terms.
Right. Because people, like someone will say like, oh, I'm healthy. It's like please define healthy.
Well, I'm not dead.
Right.
And for some, that is the definition.
Right. And like I say it, and it like if you think it's a funny thing to say because people are like, oh, I feel good, or I'm healthy, or I'm rich, or that's that's not that's not okay. Like define okay, and it's like it usually gets a laugh from people, but I'm like I try to make sure I don't know what that means to you. All these no words mean anything except what it means to the person. So just even going deeper into that. So like a conversation I was having with one of my friends a couple months ago now, we were talking about the whole idea of like needs, and I was talking about within the context of, because I just started reading Walden, which I never finished, but
good book though.
But he was talking about, and yeah, I need to pick it up again. Is if you just have your basic needs, your food, your water, your shelter, that's all you need. And I remember having a conversation. First of all, me just thinking like, can I and can we as a family just be happy if we just have that? But then I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and he's like, yeah, I think I could. He's like, but then the thoughts come in of like, sometimes, I'm deserving of prosperity. I'm deserving, and I'm like, define prosperity.
And what do you mean by deserve?
Yeah, right. But then what he was saying, because before that conversation, what we're talking about is how much culture defines things for us, defines what we want, defines what we wear, defines everything unbeknownst to us.
Right.
So then that's the part of the story I forgot. But then I said to him, define prosperity. And he laughed because he's like, oh, because I'm defining prosperity the way I've been indoctrinated to think what prosperity means.
Right.
And prosperity could just mean you're filled with happiness and joy in a moment, regardless of whatever's going on, as long as your basic needs are met.
Or it means you live paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
Which, in the sense of the world, that puts us in like the top 1% of the world is if you make $30,000 a year and you own a car and you rent an apartment, you're in like the top 1%.
Right.
People in the world. So it's like prosperous compared to what?
Right. And and that just gets into the whole thing. It's like comparing gets to be dangerous too and all that, but it's like regardless of whatever situation you are facing, can you be like basic needs met, basic needs, food, water, shelter.
Right.
Can you be like, and I say this to Jasmine, having it with her all the time, and Like, can we really truly be happy? I think for me, I think that's the biggest test of faith, the biggest test, will. I would say faith more so, but like, can you really truly be happy if that's? And I would like to think yes. I don't know until I'm put in a situation, but I'm also aware that I've become more aware that everything after that. Because living in New York, we used to go to concerts and go to Broadway shows and do all of the things, and I wouldn't say I put a lot of like high status value on it. I enjoy doing it, but I'm in New York. I'm paying these exorbitant, ridiculous amount of money for rent, so I might as well enjoy this stuff. So I'm doing it. But then once the lockdowns and all that started, I remember sitting on a couch with Jasmine. I'm like, we're never going to another concert again. It's like we're just not going to be able to because we're going to have to comply and do all of these things. And I'm like, I'm done. Like, I'm never going again.
It's like that joke of where it's like, it's all perspective, because I have a friend who, he works out each day. He reads 4 books a week. He has sex 5 times a week. He has his own chef. He doesn't have to worry about work. And all this guy can do is complain about how he's in prison. And it's like, so it's one of the things I like the most. One of the quotes was, I think it was from Jim Rohn, who said, "It's not about what you do; it's about who you're being while you're doing it." Mm-hmm. And for some people, and I think it's a very much a part of the American spirit when we talk about the American spirit, is the idea of, even if I suffer for it, at least I'm living life on my terms. And one of the most profound experiences I had as far as my vision for my future was when my second grandma passed away. And these were 2 gals who weren't related to me, but I worked for them since I was a young teen, and they passed away in their late 80s, and they were my grandmas, and they were wild characters, and they were great. And after the funeral of the second one, they died within a couple months of each other, I went to Cliff's for supper, and we had a glass of wine, and he toasted them, and he said, "Here's to those 2 girls who had a vision for their life and set out and lived it." And I thought, man, if that is the only thing that's said when I pass away, that's beautiful. Because, like, these girls were crazy. They were wild. There were some things where I was like, whoa. But that is absolutely what they did, is they discovered how they wanted to live and what they wanted to do, and they did it. And it was not until they passed away, when I was in my mid-20s, early 20s, where I realized how rare that is, of people actually like going deep, wanting to in the first place, and then doing it, and then acting on what they find of like, what is actually important to me. And I've discovered with me, what's important to me is spending time with my parents while I still can. I enjoy it immensely. I'll sit around for 3 or 4 hours around a meal and just talk to them, and it's fun. I don't do it out of an obligation. I do it because I enjoy it, and I've recognized I enjoy this. I need to do this more. This is good. And I'm really grateful that I was able to do that. And I'm really grateful that you discovered what was important for you, and you leaned into it, and you had a great spouse to support you and believe in you and share your vision. I really think that's awesome, man. So good on you. Love that.